Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing another player review, and we are down to the bottom 3 players on the San Jose Sharks this season. And first up is the Sharks starting goaltender, I guess you could call him, Martin Jones. And I'm actually going to jump immediately into his statistics this season, as that I'm going to end up talking about these a lot. So 4 games started, 34 games, 15 wins in those 34 starts, a 3.28 GAA and a .896 save percentage. So obviously those stats do not look appealing, but when you look deeper into them, you find out that they may even be worse than they actually appear. But let's first start off with, general expectations for Martin Jones. When he first arrived in San Jose at the 2015 draft, it was a sort of you could say 3-way deal between the Bruins and the Kings, but I don't think the Kings actually wanted the Sharks to get Martin Jones, but the Kings gave him over to the Bruins in the Milan Lucic trade, and then the Bruins sort of turned the other way and gave Jones to the Sharks, and the Sharks immediately signed him to a 3-year deal worth about $3 million per year, and it was a bit of a trial run to see if he could be the starter of the future for the San Jose Sharks. Low money investment for not a ton of years. We'll see what happens. And in the first year, it paid massive dividends. Not only was he a very good goaltender during the regular season, at least top 10, if not even top 7. He was also very elite, bringing his game to another level during the playoffs that year, and it helped the Sharks get to their first ever Stanley Cup Finals in franchise history. And he was really the best player for the San Jose Sharks in that final series against the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the only reason it ended up going the 6 games that it did. The following year, he was still very solid in the regular season, and by far the Sharks' best player in the year 1 playoff series in the playoffs that year. And then again in the final year of that 3-year deal, he was quite strong in the regular season of 2017-2018 and pretty good in those playoffs as well. And so, rightfully so, Doug Wilson ended up rewarding Martin Jones with a 6-year deal with, a money amount that seemed quite fair for where Martin Jones was at the time. No one would call him the best goaltender in the NHL. No one would necessarily call him a top 5 goalie in the NHL, but he was certainly in conversations for that top 10, and as I said, maybe even for that top 7 or 8. So no one really could have predicted the massive fall-off that ended up occurring after that 17-18 season. In 18-19, the Sharks would still end up making the playoffs, but that was mostly because they had such a deep team up front that they actually managed to outscore their goaltending issues. And then when Jones came into the playoffs, while it was a massive struggle to start, he ended up recovering somewhat to be okay enough for the rest of the playoffs with a few great games here or there. Game 6 against the Golden Knights obviously comes to mind. But once the Sharks arrived in the 1920 season and the Sharks became a lot less deep up front and a lot less offensive help, Martin Jones was kind of exposed for what he ended up what he should have been exposed for in the previous season, and the Sharks were just disastrous that year. And so coming into this season, the Sharks were not necessarily expecting a massive rebound, but they had brought in Devan Dubnyk to potentially be a 1A, 1B situation goaltending-wise, maybe push Martin Jones a bit and try to help a bit of a rebound in terms of performance. So I wasn't necessarily expecting back to top 10 goaltending. I wasn't even necessarily expecting league average goaltending, but I was expecting him to not, at the very least, find himself in the bottom 5 in the league, and that's exactly where he found himself. In terms of, an interesting stat to look at would be goals saved or expected goals saved, which is essentially based on the shots a goaltender has faced. How many of those goals is he expected to have saved? How many goals is he expected to have let in compared to how many goals he actually did end up letting in? And Martin Jones found himself second to last with almost a full 19 goals more than expected let in, only above Flyers goaltender Brian Elliott in that regard. And so a lot of people always talk about when it comes to defending Martin Jones that, oh yeah, but he wouldn't actually be that awful if the Sharks just played better defense in front of him. And that's definitely true. Martin Jones' stats would certainly go up if the Sharks weren't so much of a sieve defensively. But let's not kid ourselves in thinking that Martin Jones would be a league average goaltender if the Sharks had league average defense. He would still certainly trail behind just based on his games. I mean, a lot of the times you're saying, yeah, maybe he didn't have much of a chance on the shot, but a lot of the times you're also saying, well, that was a bit of a weak goal, and it just happens way too often. One very, very interesting stat as well is how many times Martin Jones was pulled this season. 8 different times. And reminder, he only started 34 games this season. That means in almost every fourth game, Martin Jones ended up getting pulled. This ended up being a Sharks record for most times a goaltender was pulled in a season. And may I remind you that the record was previously held in a season that was, of course, 82 games long. Martin Jones managed to get it in a season that had 26 less games than normal, just 56 games, and you can imagine previously it was held, in a goaltender who's actually, back in the day, goaltenders used to get a lot more starts. We saw Evgeny Nabokov would frequently get, 70 plus starts during the regular season a few years ago, whether that was a good choice or a bad choice, that's up for debate. But a few years ago, that was kind of the norm at the NHL level. Now, starting goaltenders are getting maybe 60 max games played during the regular season unless you really need to ride them really hard. So 34 games started in a max 56 game season, and you managed to get pulled 8 times is impressive with how bad that actually ends up being. And there were certainly a few times where Bob Booner was maybe not so justified in pulling Martin Jones, and it was kind of just done for no reason, I guess you could say, but still 8 times does not reflect very well onto you. Now, the question can then end up being, what really caused this downturn in Martin Jones's play from the 17-18 season and the 2 years prior where he was actually very good to the 18-19 season and the 2 years after where he was actually very bad? There's speculation that, the Sharks just as a whole took a downturn defensively. There was speculation that since that was Erik Karlsson's first year as a San Jose Shark, that maybe the Sharks system as a whole changed so significantly that it really hurt Martin Jones's game. There's speculation that the changes to the rules of goalie equipment, making you have to have smaller pads and smaller chest protectors and things like that, really affected Martin Jones's game. There's also, the very harsh rumors that Martin Jones was just in it for a payday, and once he got that 6-year deal at $5.75 million, that he kind of just laid back and didn't really take it all that seriously anymore. There's a lot of speculation, and one of the usual main things that it is for a goaltender or just players in general is age, but the fact is that Martin Jones was 28 or 29 years old at the time that his downturn happened, which is usually a lot, many years prior to where you would expect that. You usually expect such a major downturn at maybe 34, 35 years old, not before you're even 30 years old. And so it really is a mystery what happened with Martin Jones, because his goals against average has gone up slightly every single year he's played. But the fact is that it was such a massive jump from the, 2.5 or so in 17-18 to the 2.9, almost 3 of 18-19. And his save percentage used to be very solidly, league average or somewhat even above league average. The lowest in those first 3 years that he had with the Sharks was a .912. And now suddenly the last 3 years, he hasn't even managed to get to that 900 save percentage just yet. He's been at 896 for all 3 years in a row, which I guess is some sort of a coincidence. And so when we move on to the grading of Martin Jones, even if the expectations weren't all that high, he definitely came in rather below those expectations. What's interesting, though, is that Martin Jones himself actually had a pretty decent stretch of games this season. Most of his March month and early parts of April actually went rather well. They weren't insane, but they were pretty good. And so it kind of speaks not only to, how bad the rest of the season was for him, but also the fact that we're kind of clinging on to such a brief stretch of play from a starting goaltender at the NHL level as a way to justify his play. And so just in general, looking over the full season, it was a third straight year where Martin Jones was pretty much an unmitigated disaster in net. He was a bottom 3 goaltender in the NHL, and I don't think there was that much of a discussion, there's that much of an argument to be had about that. And the only thing that was keeping him from an even lower grade than this is because expectations were already rather low coming in, and as such, he gets the grade of a D+. Class dismissed.